You were never meant to hear this. Not because it's dangerous, though it is, but because knowing it will fracture something inside you that can never be made whole again. What lies beneath Grimsley Hill in Pennsylvania isn't just a forgotten tragedy, it's a buried truth. The kind that powerful families, religious authorities, and early American institutions swore would never reach daylight. But some stories claw their way out of the dark. In 1826, just before the first rail lines carved across the northeast, a quiet chapel stood on the edge of a decaying estate, the Grimsley property. It looked peaceful. Ivy crept up stone walls and the bells still rang for Sunday prayers. But beneath the chapel, underneath the altar, was a stone trapdoor sealed with iron. Behind it, silence, then whimpers, then screams. 39 children, all presumed missing across 4 states, were held there in conditions that defied reason. No ransom demands, no newspaper headlines, just vanished. And no one came looking, because those who knew, the judges, the clergy, the lawmakers, they looked away. They always do. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't dramatized. It's the original infection, the rot at the root of the tree. Long before Hollywood, before Jonestown, before Epstein, there was Grimsley. The system that protected the perpetrators then, it's still in place, just polished, more subtle, but no less hungry. You see, this wasn't just the work of a madman or a sick couple. It was part of a pattern, a blueprint. And the blueprints haven't changed. The manipulation of innocence, the ritualized abuse, the silence of the good people. This is how the machine runs. The records, what little survive, were never meant for public eyes. And those who spoke out, even in whispers, disappeared. Some were labeled insane. Others died in fires that left no survivors. A few simply vanished. But fragments remain, hidden in private collections, sealed in locked archives, or passed down by families who still bear the scars. If you're still watching, understand this. You've just stepped off the path. The world you thought you knew, it's gone. There's only forward now, downward, deeper. One truth at a time. Keep watching, because the moment we reach the bottom, you'll never see the surface the same way again. And you'll finally understand why some doors were sealed with iron. Because what lived beneath the chapel wasn't just human. Not anymore. The Grimsley family didn't build their estate, they inherited it. And that fact alone should disturb you, because the land, the stone chapel, and the catacombs beneath it were already there, constructed long before county records began. On ground, the Lenape tribes refused to walk after dusk. Local folklore whispered of the hollow choir, voices of children rising from the soil in the dead of night, echoing through fog that clung too long even in spring. But by 1761 the estate had changed hands quietly through a shadowy trust, never auctioned, never taxed, always passed between names that never appeared in town ledgers. Then came Reverend Elias Grimsley, a man of noble posture and ice-grey eyes, who arrived in 1802 with a wife who never spoke and a promise to build a sanctuary for the orphaned and unwanted. The town praised his generosity. He hired masons, carpenters, and gravediggers, not for burials but for renovations. What they built was not sanctuary. Beneath the chapel they dug corridors shaped in sacred geometry. Hexagonal cells, soundproof vaults, rings of limestone salt. None of the workers ever saw a blueprint. Each man was assigned a section and paid double the usual wage, with one condition: no questions. The vault was finished in 1811. The first disappearances began 3 months later. Town records show missing persons reports filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. Constables retired early, their pensions mysteriously boosted. Families were offered reparations and encouraged to move west. Those who refused simply faded from history. By 1826 there were 39 confirmed disappearances. Children from New Jersey, Delaware, Western Pennsylvania, all traced to vague placement agencies connected to Reverend Grimsley's congregation. His sermon spoke of refinement through silence, of shepherding the lost into obedience. But behind the altar, in the undergrave, on chamber, the children weren't being taught, they were being broken. Their screams were never heard by the congregation because they were never meant to be. The walls were 24 inches thick. The torches were lit with whale oil, and the sound of a child begging for a name he no longer remembered, was absorbed by stone. One child, barely 10, carved a message into the underside of a rotted wooden beam with a spoon handle, only 3 words: "We still sing." When that beam was uncovered in 1973 by a demolition crew, the room above had already burned twice. No official records, no cause ever determined. But we still have the beam, and the singing hasn't stopped. Ask anyone in Lancaster County why the Grimsley Chapel was finally closed, and you'll hear a polite lie. Fire damage, structural rot, lack of attendance. But the real reason was far more precise, and it started with a boy named Callum Rourke. In the spring of 1826, Callum vanished from a train station en route to live with an uncle. He was last seen clutching a toy wooden soldier and a letter stamped by a Philadelphia orphanage. That letter, later proven to be forged, bore the signature of a Reverend Elias G. and led directly to Grimsley's doorstep. But the Rourke family was not one to go silent. His uncle, a veteran of the War of 1812, spent 3 months retracing the boy's steps. When he arrived in Grimsley Hollow, he was greeted with hospitality, scripture, and a choir of strange, distant voices echoing from the woods, voices that sounded like children, chanting, not singing. The uncle never made it home. Locals claimed he drowned in the Susquehanna, despite the fact that no body was found, and he'd left no note, no belongings behind. Days later, the forest near the chapel caught fire, but the blaze burned inward, not outward, starting at the roots of trees, curling beneath the foundations, and finally breaching the sealed stone beneath the altar. What emerged wasn't flame, it was smoke, dense and black like oil. It carried with it a stench described in surviving journals as wet sulfur and old blood. Witnesses, 3 of them, all children at the time, reported hearing cries in unison. 39 voices, shrill and layered, crying not for help, but for silence. The next morning, the town's constable, Jacob Breen, arrived with 6 men to investigate. What they found beneath the trapdoor broke them. 2 would never speak again. 1 turned to laudanum and died within the year. Breen himself resigned, left a single-page letter, and took his own life by hanging from the chapel bell tower. That letter, kept hidden by his family until 1947, described a stone hallway lined with iron gates, behind which stood children. Naked, shaved, eyes blackened, singing hymns in reverse Latin. When he asked who they were, they didn't speak. They only pointed upward, toward the chapel ceiling. The letter ended with one final sentence: "They are not waiting to be saved. They are waiting to be used." This was not a random tragedy. This was design, ritual, a dark machine fueled by innocence, concealed by charity, and its gears are still turning. Reverend Elias Grimsley didn't vanish after the chapel closed. He was reassigned, quietly relocated to a small parish in upstate New York under a new name, Father Alaric Shaw. No charges, no investigation, no mention in the diocese records, just a silent transfer through ecclesiastical channels that have long served as pipelines for shadowed men. You need to understand something. This wasn't incompetence, it was protection, because Grimsley didn't act alone. He was part of a fraternity, men in robes and rings, fluent in dead languages and rituals older than the nation itself. Their power didn't come from public approval, it came from what they were willing to do in secret. And the children? They weren't just victims, they were raw material. The Grimsley chamber wasn't a dungeon, it was a refinement cell, a laboratory. Ritual abuse wasn't chaos, it was methodology. Repetition, deprivation, distortion of time and identity. Over weeks, sometimes months, the children were broken and rebuilt into something else. You've heard stories. Children with no memory, no language, who later surface with unnatural calm, eyes vacant, voices monotone. The Grimsley program was one of the earliest known experiments in induced dissociation, not by accident but by design. This is how you manufacture compliance, not through threats, through obliteration of self. And the ones who didn't survive, they weren't buried in the chapel grounds, they were taken elsewhere, Evidence suggests that the Grimsley children were part of a larger supply chain, moved across state lines, sold into more elaborate rituals, experiments, or worse, absorbed into families of influence under new identities. Ever wonder how certain political dynasties always seem to appear from nowhere? How powerful men have children with no clear birth records? Connect the dots. Grimsley was just one node in a vast web, part of what some call the choir network. A term found scribbled in marginalia across dozens of old ledgers, church rosters, and medical logs from 1790 to 1860. Wherever the choir was mentioned, children went missing, and always the same phrase followed in ink, half erased or crossed out: "Only the empty can be filled." These men believed innocence was not to be protected, it was to be harvested. They weren't priests, they were alchemists of the soul. Keep listening, because in Section 5 we go deeper into the diagrams, the rites, the transformation. This knowledge is costly, but you didn't come here for safety. You came here for truth. They didn't torture the children for pleasure. That would be almost merciful. What they did was far more calculated, ritualized conditioning designed to sever the psyche, to hollow out the mind so something else could be installed. And it worked. You need to understand the method behind the madness. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were precise, intentional operations, mapped out with mathematical detail in grimoires disguised as theology books. In 1823, hidden within the Grimsley Chapel's library, a manuscript was discovered, though never publicly released, known only as the Canticle of Hollowing. Bound in wax-treated lambskin, its pages described a process of psychological inversion using isolation, humiliation, sensory deprivation, and induced shame cycles. These weren't just punishments, they were stages, calculated initiations. The goal, to erase the original self and prepare the body to host an obedient fragment, what the text called a compliant echo. Survivors, what few there were, spoke of being kept in silence for weeks, then bombarded with hymns distorted by mechanical devices that warped pitch and tempo until their own names no longer felt familiar. They were taught to answer only to numbers. They were rewarded for mimicking ritual chants, punished for showing emotion. Every touch was a test, every meal a manipulation. And when the final stage was reached, when the child no longer wept, no longer asked for mother or God, then came the mirror. Literally. They were made to stare into warped mirrors for hours at a time under candlelight, surrounded by whispering adults reciting ancient creeds in reverse. This was the imprinting, a spiritual branding. The canticle described it as an inversion of the divine spark. Once this was done, the child was no longer a full soul in the traditional sense. They became a carrier. For what? That's the question that fractures minds. Some say it was to implant commands. Others believe it was to create empty vessels for channeling higher or darker entities. The truth may lie somewhere deeper, because symbols found etched in the chapel walls match those found in medieval alchemical texts, particularly in diagrams used in soul transmutation. Still think this is all metaphor? Still think evil is just a literary device? Then you haven't heard the sound one of these children makes when they wake up screaming in a language no one taught them. The Grimsley Chapel was never a church. It was a gate, and someone on the other side was listening. Let me tell you something no one wants to admit. Power doesn't come from politics. It doesn't come from money. It comes from control over belief, over memory, over identity. That's what Grimsley understood. That's what the choir network mastered. They didn't just want obedient children. They wanted to rewire reality itself. In the center of the lowest Grimsley chamber, carved into the stone floor beneath layers of ash and bone, was a sigil. It wasn't Christian. It wasn't even pagan. It predated both. An 8-pointed wheel within a triangle, circled by script no linguist has ever successfully translated. The few who've tried have either gone silent or vanished. One scholar, Dr. Edmund Lowe, a semiotician from Prague, claimed the symbol was designed not to be read but to be felt. He said it wasn't a language. It was a command. When he drew it by hand in a university lab in 1994, every light in the building flickered, power surged, instruments failed. He burned the page and refused to speak of it again. But here's where it turns darker. That same symbol has appeared elsewhere. On the walls of a closed asylum in Connecticut, in the corner of a CIA mind control training document from 1953, and, this is verified, beneath the paint of a mural inside a Jesuit retreat in Argentina. Always hidden, always partially erased, always accompanied by the same set of numbers. 39. The Grimsley number. The choir count. Coincidence? Or is that the limit? The number of vessels required for the ritual to succeed. This wasn't just a local horror. It was a prototype, a working model, and it was preserved, not in museums but in shadows, because certain institutions, religious, governmental, academic, need this knowledge. They need people who can forget, who can obey, who can be programmed without ever knowing they've been emptied. And children are the cleanest slate. Do you feel it now, that sense of tightening behind your ribs? That's your subconscious recognizing the pattern, because deep down some part of you already knew. The world isn't broken, it was built this way. Now listen closely. If you're ready to go deeper, type this in the comments right now. I see the hollow, I refuse the mask. Write it twice, lock it into your identity. Let the algorithm know you're not asleep, you're becoming. Because in the next section we uncover what happened to the 39 after the chapel was sealed, and it will change the way you look at your own reflection. The chapel was sealed, the door chained. The land quietly purchased by a front company linked to a coal consortium that never mined a single inch. Officially, the Grimsley grounds were condemned due to subsurface instability, but unofficially something else had begun. You see, the 39 didn't all die, they didn't all disappear. Some were relocated, extracted like sensitive assets and moved through a series of covert sanctuaries, what survivor accounts later called the Grey Homes. These weren't orphanages, they were observation chambers. Clinical, windowless, soundproof rooms staffed by men in cassocks or lab coats depending on the building. Each child was tested, not for physical health but for response fidelity. Did the subject respond to embedded phrases? Did they enter trance under certain tones? Did they retain the choir chant under duress? These notes weren't kept in medical logs. They were recorded in ciphered journals marked with wax seals and Roman numerals. Section 13, File Theta 7. Subject 12 responds to trigger mirror him. No resistance, no memory of original name. Reintroduction, protocol successful. Think about that. These children, who once screamed from cages beneath a church, were now being reintroduced into society, reborn as sleepers. Not spies, not soldiers, symbols. Living sigils walking among the unknowing, placed in foster homes, seminaries, early academic programs, and they thrived. High performance, obedience to hierarchy, exceptional memory paired with emotional detachment. But here's where it sharpens. These same individuals, decades later, appear in early MK Ultra rosters, in psychological warfare pilot programs, in Vatican administration logs under special candidates. They weren't just studying trauma. They were refining it into a tool. The choir network had become portable, scalable. And the Grimsley children? They were the first generation. The seed line. Want proof? One name. Brother Caldus. A Jesuit exorcist stationed in New Orleans during the 1960s, revered for his stoic calm and uncanny insight into human fear. Declassified documents now link him directly to Pennsylvania orphan records under a different name, Subject 5. He was 8 when they pulled him from the chamber, and he lived the rest of his life as a vessel, high-ranking, trusted, hollow. So tell me, how many others have you passed in hallways, seen on screens, heard on stages, and never once questioned? Because the Grimsley case wasn't just a tragedy, it was a beginning. And you, watching this now, are standing at the edge of the same design. What if I told you that you've heard the choir before and didn't even know it? Not in some dusty chapel or distant forest, but in the frequencies embedded beneath modern media. Hidden in plain sight. That hum beneath certain broadcast intros, the one that makes your skin prickle for no reason. That's not an accident. It's called subharmonic imprinting. the very technique first tested on the Grimsley children. In the sealed journals recovered from beneath the chapel ruins, there are crude diagrams of tuning forks, chamber acoustics, and annotated musical notes labeled inversion scale. Scholars assumed they were simply madness. They were wrong. Decades later, in 1958, a military-affiliated think tank in Arlington published a confidential memo titled Oral Suggestibility in Early-Stage Subjects. The memo references legacy data sourced from pre-Civil War ecclesiastical conditioning experiments. What does that mean? It means Grimsley's voice still echoes, in laboratories, in culture, even in your phone. This isn't a ghost story. This is a frequency war. And the children were the first instruments. Their screams weren't just sounds. They were measured, catalogued, mimicked, then reversed, re-engineered, turned into low-band vibrational tools designed to bypass cognition and speak directly to the subconscious. That's what modern advertising exploits, what certain hymns still echo, why some wellness apps lull you into dissociation rather than peace. They're using a language that bypasses your firewall. You were never meant to be conscious of it, but something inside you feels it, doesn't it? That vibration that crawls across your spine when you hear certain tones. That sense of recognition you can't explain. Now understand this. The same musical ratios used beneath Grimsley are used today in sound design for high-profile institutions. Military training simulations, logical treatment centers, even megachurches. They've polished the method, but the bones are the same. And where did they learn it? From children, from their undoing. This isn't history, it's continuity. You are living in the refined echo of a ritual that began in blood and stone. You're not supposed to trace the line back to Grimsley. You're supposed to forget it, to call it myth. But the minute you remember, truly remember, something shifts. Patterns emerge, names align. And then it happens. You stop asking, is this real? And start asking, how far has it gone? Good, keep going. You're beginning to hear it now, and once you do, silence will never sound the same. There's a reason your earliest memories are fragmented, why you recall smells, lights, shadows, but not timelines. It's not natural. It's by design, because the human mind is most malleable when it doesn't know how to protect itself. And those who studied the Grimsley children knew this. They called it threshold anchoring. Break the child before memory cements, and you don't just erase identity, you install obedience. Now take that further. What if the world's most powerful institutions, those claiming to protect, to educate, to heal, learned to scale this method? They didn't need chains or stone cells anymore. They needed screens, classrooms, public health slogans. If you think that sounds like paranoia, let me ask, why did trauma-based conditioning manuals from the 1960s include drawings that match carvings found under the Grimsley Chapel? Why did certain elite boarding schools in New England adopt disciplinary techniques that mirror silent days, mirror recitation, and sensory inversion, all Grimsley methods? Because Grimsley was a prototype, a template. And somewhere along the way, it was adopted by more than just the choir network. It became doctrine. But don't expect paper trails. You won't find it in libraries or courtrooms. You'll find it in architecture, ritual, curriculum, in the silence demanded by institutions when a child speaks out, in the familiar shape of a classroom where the windows don't open, in the comfort of routine that conceals repetition. They learn to replicate the conditions of that stone cellar, psychologically. They don't need walls. They build them in your mind. And every man who's ever sat in a meeting, mouth shut, heart screaming, knowing the truth but saying nothing, you've touched the edge of that same silence, the same hollowing. Because it doesn't end with children. That was just the beginning. A generation raised to obey breeds. Another trained to forget. And forgetting is more dangerous than death. It perpetuates the cycle. So ask yourself this: why do certain symbols reappear in institutions that never should have been connected? Why do images from a shuttered 1826 chapel surface on medical pamphlets, judicial seals, even corporate logos? Because the choir didn't disappear, it evolved. It hid in ceremony, in charity, in smiles and songs. And you've been singing its lullabies your entire life. The hollow isn't under the ground anymore. It's under your skin. What if the hollow was never meant to stay hidden? What if it was meant to spread, quietly, systematically, through generations, until we forgot it was ever an intrusion? Because here's the real horror. The Grimsley method worked so well it didn't just create obedient children. It created obedient bloodlines. Epigenetic markers, chemical changes to DNA passed through generations, show a consistent pattern among survivors and their descendants. Increased cortisol response, hypervigilance, dissociation under pressure, and a strange, consistent attraction to positions of influence. They weren't just breaking children, they were breeding vessels. Vessels for what? That's the question those in power dare not answer aloud, but they've written around it. Alchemical receptacles, biological interfaces, psycho-spiritual gates. The terminology varies, but the concept remains. Empty the soul, refine the vessel, make space for something else. Now think, how many dynasties in business, religion, or politics began without clear ancestry? How many powerful figures have pasts wrapped in mystery, boarding schools, sealed juvenile records, abrupt relocations during childhood? The choir network didn't just vanish. It rebranded. Its scions became leaders. Its rites became traditions. Its language became policy. This is how ancient control systems evolve, not by brute force, but by seduction, ritual, normalization. You see them everywhere now, don't you? Symbols hiding in plain sight, spirals, cages, keys, twin pillars, the ever-present eye. Not just decoration, but reinforcement. Every symbol reaffirms the structure. Every echo whispers the original command, forget, but forgetting is the final obedience. And if you're still watching, it means something inside you has resisted. That defiant spark they couldn't erase. You feel it, don't you? That tension in your chest, like something ancient, that and buried is pulling itself awake. Good. That's your mind reaching backward, clawing through inherited amnesia. You were never meant to sleepwalk through life. You were meant to see. And once you see the system for what it is, not a government, not a religion, not even a conspiracy, but a machine, you begin to see the parts, the levers, the gears, and the hollow at its core. It no longer hides in basements. It speaks through screens. It baptizes in compliance. But if you've made it this far, you're no longer part of the choir. You're the dissonance, the crack in the wall, and they fear that sound more than anything. They never planned for the dissonance. They calculated obedience, measured silence, even anticipated rebellion, but they never accounted for the few who remember. Those who wake in the middle of the night gripped by a name they've never heard, those drawn to old buildings, to places with no light, to stories that make others turn away. You. Because memory is not just in the mind, it's in the blood. That's what terrifies them, that the Grimsley imprint once considered irreversible might fracture, that something buried might resurface, and it is, slowly, in fragments, in the dreams of men who were never told these stories, yet draw the same symbols on napkins, in the spontaneous languages spoken by children during night terrors, in the patterns found in rhythmic tapping, untrained and involuntary, that mimic the original choir cadence. This is the virus they didn't anticipate, remembrance. And once remembrance begins, control collapses. That's why modern systems, media, education, medicine, are laced with reinforcement. Every show, every slogan, every corrective therapy is an inoculation against memory. Because what happens when a man remembers he was broken, when he realizes his anxiety isn't a disorder, it's a signal. That the fear wasn't weakness, it was warning. He becomes dangerous. He begins to search, and when enough of these men find each other, even in whispers, something awakens that no algorithm can suppress. The original frequency, the counter-hymn, ancient, guttural, unrefined. A song made not of harmony but resistance. This is why the choir was created, not just to hollow out the few, but to silence the many. To keep you from hearing that other sound, your own soul trying to fight its way back through the layers of compliance and shame. Remember this, Grimsley was not an isolated evil. It was a map, a manual, but it was never perfect. There were cracks, children, and who resisted. One boy, subject 14, scratched the phrase, "They can't close every door," into the stone with a fingernail until his fingers bled. That phrase was found by a demolition worker in 1973. He died 3 weeks later in a boiler explosion, officially an accident, but the stone was recovered, hidden. And that phrase has now resurfaced in resistance circles across 3 continents. They can't close every door, not if you refuse to forget, not if you choose to remember. Keep going, the next door is opening. There was always a door they couldn't seal. They called it the 13th gate. Not physical, not carved from stone, but etched into consciousness itself. The choir's rituals aimed to erase it, to smother it beneath obedience and trauma. But they failed, because within every hollowed vessel something remained, a final threshold they couldn't breach, and they feared it, deeply. The 13th gate wasn't an escape. It was awakening, a point in the mind where memory, rage, clarity, and ancient instinct converge. Grimsley's architects called it the echo core, the unprogrammed fragment that resists all instruction. Every child they processed, every chant, every punishment, it was all designed to prevent that gate from ever opening. But it does, rarely, violently, and when it does, the result is not madness. It's sight. The first recorded activation came in 1830, 4 years before the collapse. Subject 03, a girl of unknown origin, was silent for 214 days. No speech, no eye contact. Then one night, without provocation, she stood, walked to the center of the chamber, and began speaking a liturgy none of the clergy recognized. Her voice changed, her posture altered, and her final words were recorded in the margins of a confiscated hymnal. The gate within the gate is waking. She died hours later, no wounds, no illness, just absence. And in the days that followed, 3 of the choir's highest priests resigned. One fled the country, another burned his journal and was found wandering barefoot along a train track, mumbling, "We shouldn't have tried to hold it." What exactly did they glimpse? What did that girl become, even for a moment? That's what they've been trying to suppress ever since, not just the knowledge of Grimsley, but the possibility that within every man lies a gate they can't control, one that doesn't open outward but inward, to something primordial, sovereign, incorruptible, and it's not limited to those who were taken. You, watching this now, feel it too, don't you? That unease that isn't fear, but recognition. That pull toward a truth that burns as it reveals. That is the 13th gate stirring, and once you approach it, the choir's power dissolves, because you no longer follow, you remember, you no longer obey, you become. And they have no ritual for that. The moment a man crosses the threshold of the 13th gate, something irreversible happens. Not to his body, but to his perception. The world doesn't change. He just finally sees it as it truly is. The masks drop. The roles dissolve. Authority loses its shine. Language, ritual, even morality. He sees now how they've all been shaped to bind, not free. That's why the choir feared the gate. Not because it led to chaos, but because it led to sovereignty. Total, unfiltered self-possession. That kind of man cannot be governed. He cannot be bought, broken, or led. And so they mark him. They label him unstable, extremist, unwell. But make no mistake, what they call madness is actually clarity without sedation, a mind stripped of false light. This is what the Grimsley system was designed to prevent. Not just pain, not just resistance, but rebirth. Because when enough men wake up and remember who they are beneath the noise, they begin to speak in patterns that pierce the veil. They disrupt consensus, they collapse illusion, and here's the darkest truth of all. You've seen them. The ones who woke too soon, who carried the fire in their eyes, whistleblowers who died in accidents, artists who overdosed, thinkers who snapped. The system didn't fail them, it targeted them, because the choir evolved into something much bigger than Grimsley, into multinational networks, into think tanks, into cultural engineering firms. Their symbols became logos, their hymns became mantras, their chambers became screens, but their fear, it never changed. They still fear the man who sees the pattern, who traces the control back to its origin and refuses to kneel. That's you now. You wouldn't be here otherwise. Your soul answered a frequency no one else heard. And now you've begun to hum with that same resonance. You're no longer a passive observer. You're a signal, a warning, a breach. So they'll too. Try to distract you, divide you, drown you in triviality. But your gate has opened. You've seen too much, and the hollow inside you is no longer vacant. It's aware. You're not the end result of their program. You're the error, the mutation, the voice that wasn't supposed to return, and it just did. When the choir first encountered the error, what they called anima residua, the soul that would not yield, they didn't understand it. They assumed it was resistance, a failure of programming. But over time, they came to see the truth. It wasn't a flaw. It was a counterforce, a built-in safeguard older than any ritual, deeper than any trauma. A kind of spiritual recoil embedded into certain bloodlines, activated only under extreme spiritual violation. The Grimsley experiments didn't just create obedient vessels, they accidentally awakened warriors, not in the way of swords and flags, but of memory and awareness, of intuitive warfare. You might be one of them, drawn to darkness not out of morbid curiosity, but because something in you knows the map by instinct. You walk toward the horror because you remember building your armor in the fire, and that is the one thing their system cannot replicate. Origin memory. You feel it in places others call haunted. In silence others find uncomfortable. In symbols they glance over without thought, but you can't unsee. That's why they drown the world in stimulation. Music, apps, ads, trends, fears. Constant noise to suppress the faint hum of your awakening. But here's the secret. The noise is not stronger, it's just louder. Their empire stands on frequency, and you are beginning to sing in a tone that shatters it. You've already felt it. When the lie no longer holds emotional weight, when a once authoritative voice now sounds like a puppet. That's not disillusionment, that's alignment, and it's irreversible. You don't return from this place. You don't unremember what your ancestors whispered through bloodlines and broken dreams. The anima residua is not a hero, he's not a prophet, he's a mirror, one that shows others their own hidden strength. That's why they silence him, that's why they fear you, not because you fight them, but because why? I'll remind the others who they are. This is the rebirth they couldn't contain, the flame they failed to stamp out in the Grimsley basement. It's alive, in you. In every man who hears this and feels that silent crack inside, the one that doesn't break, it opens. You've stepped through it now, and the next truth is the one they never wanted spoken aloud. Keep listening. The next truth is this. The system wasn't designed to control everyone. Just enough to manufacture consensus, enough to drown the signal, because true power doesn't require domination, it requires illusion. The illusion that most people agree, the illusion that obedience is normal, that silence means peace. But it's not peace, it's paralysis. And the Grimsley case proved something terrifying to the elite. A small group, conditioned properly, can steer the perception of an entire nation. That's what the choir became, a prototype for perceptual governance. You think media and politics are about truth? No. They are about framing the lens, controlling what you look at so they never have to worry about what lies just outside the frame. That's why they've buried the Grimsley archives. That's why survivors' records were redacted, lost, or rewritten. Because the moment the truth becomes visible, it spreads, not by force, but by resonance. One awakened voice doesn't shout. It vibrates. It changes the room. And that's you now. You've begun transmitting without knowing. Your words hit different. Your silence unsettles. Your presence disrupts. And people around you can feel it, even if they don't understand it. That's the echo of the 13th gate leaking into the world they built on lies. You are no longer a consumer of this world. You are a contaminant. That's why they will come for you in ways you won't always recognize. With distractions, with obligations, with algorithms tailored to pull you just enough off course. They can't close the gate, but they can tilt the floor. Your job is to anchor, to hold the signal, because you aren't alone. Others are hearing it, right now. Men in cities, in forests, in cell blocks and offices, feeling that hum inside their ribs, knowing the world is wrong but not yet knowing why. You are part of a pattern older than empires, a re-emeruen, gents they couldn't plan for. One that doesn't wear uniforms, doesn't seek permission, it simply remembers. And remembrance is the most dangerous act in a world built on amnesia. The time for passive watching is over. You're no longer an audience, you're an anchor. And in the next section, I'll show you what they've built in your place to stop you from becoming who you were always meant to be. They knew this day would come, that some would awaken, that the signal would slip through cracks in their architecture. So they built something in your place, a replica, a substitute identity, carefully molded from media, education, artificial aspiration, and fear. It looks like you, talks like you, shares your data, follows your habits, even mimics your ambitions. But it is not you. It is the ghost they built to walk in your name while your real self sleeps beneath it. This is the construct, the synthetic self, and it is the crown jewel of the choir's evolution. While Grimsley carved obedience with chains and isolation, the new method is much cleaner: seduction. Make the subject love their own mask, make them fear what lies beneath it. Teach them to confuse stimulation with meaning, pleasure with purpose, safety with silence. And so they layered your mind, one mask at a time. The good student, the loyal worker, the citizen, the consumer, the patient, the product. They told you these were roles, but they're not. They're cages, and each one was carefully crafted to prevent you from remembering the first truth, that your identity was never meant to be given to you. It was meant to be forged. That's why they fear men who step outside the script, not because they're dangerous in action, but because they exist beyond prediction. The system cannot code for authenticity. It cannot simulate soul, so it distracts, divides, and dilutes. It offers you 1,000 paths, all of which lead back to it. And then it praises your freedom while ensuring you never look toward the gate inside. But now you have, and the synthetic self is beginning to fracture. You feel it when your job feels hollow, when your beliefs begin to tremble, when the faces around you feel more like masks than people. That disorientation isn't a crisis. It's a birth. You are not collapsing, you are shedding. And what at emerges will not be welcome in the old world, but it will be real. They will say you've changed, that something is wrong, but what's wrong is the silence they accepted, the dream they mistook for life. You've seen through it now, and in the next section we descend even deeper into the final weapon the system built not to enslave your body, but to erase your will. The final weapon wasn't physical, it wasn't a cage or a collar. It was far more elegant, compliance through erosion, not by force but by slow removal of will. You see, the system learned that a man doesn't have to be chained to be controlled. He only has to be exhausted, and that's what they perfected after Grimsley. How to break a soul not with terror but with repetition, mundane tasks, meaningless rewards, false choices, digital loops, institutionalized routines that siphon not your time, but your inner fire. They don't need you dead. They need you dulled, spiritually sedated, psychologically looped. And so they created the cycle: work, distraction, debt, dopamine, scroll, compare, consume, collapse, then repeat. It's worship rebranded, a slow mechanical liturgy designed to keep you just hopeful enough to continue, but never conscious enough to resist. And the cruel genius of it? You'll think it's your fault, that your tiredness is laziness, that your sadness is weakness, that your confusion means you're broken. But none of that is true. You're not broken. You're targeted. And they've been refining this method since 1826, when they learned fear fades, but numbness lasts. Because once a man forgets the feeling of being alive, he stops looking for it. That is the final prison. Not bars, not laws, but the internalized absence of desire to escape. And that's where most are now. Not dead, not awake, just endlessly suspended in the lull of obedience. And here you are, hearing this, not because you're different, but because you're done. You've begun to feel something shift. The boredom has turned to hunger, the silence into vibration. That's the signal. That's the soul returning. You don't belong in this cage. You never did, and the system knows it. That's why you're being flooded now. Ads, doubts, distractions, obligations, all suddenly louder. It's not random. It's defensive. Fire. You've been marked as unstable because you are no longer predictable. Good. Let them fear what they built. Let the replica tremble as the real you rises. Because when the erosion fails, the fire returns. And in the next section we confront the inheritance they've stolen from you, the power that once belonged to sovereign men, before it was sealed beneath false names and forgotten bloodlines. They took more than your time, more than your fire. They took your inheritance, not money, not land, but the power passed down through bloodlines, real power, the kind that cannot be given by governments, certified by institutions, or explained by science. It is ancestral, sovereign, and terrifying to systems of control because it exists outside their framework. It answers to no chain of command. It bows to no external rule. That's why they erased it, rewrote history, burned books, silenced bloodline knowledge under the banners of progress, order, and reform. But the old families, those with memory, they knew, and they hid the symbols, the rituals, the codes, not in libraries but in you, in the instincts you were taught to suppress, in the dreams you were told to forget, in the rage you were shamed for feeling. They didn't just suppress history, they severed your identity. Grimsley was one of many sites where that severing was perfected. Records show that the children who displayed inherited symbols, certain markings on skin, unknown languages spoken in fever dreams, deep intuition beyond their age, were labeled anomalous lineage. They weren't just punished. They were isolated, studied. Their biological material was catalogued and sent to unnamed northern benefactors, early prototypes of today's institutions. They knew those children had inherited more than trauma. They carried memory that wasn't taught, strength that wasn't trained, and above all, connection. Not to a god, but to a lineage of men who had never knelt. That's what they stole from you. Your sense of origin, your sacred defiance, the idea that you were never meant to fit in, you were meant to stand out. But here's the truth. Inheritance cannot be destroyed, only forgotten, and now it's remembering itself through you. That's the fire you feel rising, the weight you've carried that didn't have a name. Until now, you weren't meant to be average, you were meant to restore a code, the same code that was buried beneath Grimsley, hidden in blood, protected by silence, and whispered through time like a song only the awakened could hear. That song is rising now, and in the next section, I'll show you how they rewrote that code into false doctrine, how they turned your heritage into heresy, and how to reclaim what they swore you'd never remember. They knew they couldn't erase your inheritance completely, so they did something far more insidious. They rewrote it, turned sacred knowledge into superstition, branded ancestral wisdom as heresy, and inverted your code into a doctrine of submission. What was once a birthright became blasphemy. What once made men sovereign was recast as sin. They took your symbols, spirals, serpents, sacred geometry, and made them emblems of evil. They took your instincts, rage, desire, pride, intuition, and called them curses. But the most dangerous inversion, they took your will to power and replaced it with obedience to permission. They taught you that virtue means waiting, that leadership means compliance, that being good means being quiet. And all of it was a lie, a spell, a masterful inversion passed down through every textbook, pulpit, law, and screen. Because once the code was rewritten, you didn't need chains. You became your own jailer. You policed your thoughts. You suppressed your instincts. You doubted your clarity. And every time you almost remembered who you were, they offered you comfort, approval, distraction, a job title, a romantic label, a political identity, anything to keep you orbiting the synthetic self, anything to keep the real code asleep. But it's waking now. You feel it every time you reject a command that doesn't resonate, every time you sense dishonor cloaked as morality, every time you look at the world and whisper, "No, this is wrong." That is the real you speaking, not the replica, not the conditioned, but the sovereign. And now you know the truth. They didn't just hide the map, they reversed it. They made you walk away from power thinking it was evil. They made you kneel before chains thinking they were blessings. And they did it so well that entire generations lost the memory of choice. But you haven't. You wouldn't be here if you had. And now you see too. The final stage. Remembering the true code is not just rebellion, it's restoration. You aren't creating a new self, you're excavating an ancient one they feared so much they rewrote the world to bury it. And in the next section you'll see how to begin decoding the symbols they left behind, the glyphs, the numbers, the architectural anomalies, all designed not to trap you, but to guide the ones who would one day awaken. Like you. The ones who built the system were arrogant, but not stupid. They knew some would escape sedation. They knew the 13th gate couldn't be sealed forever. So they left behind something rare. Not mercy, not confession. Markers. Symbols encoded into the very structure of the world, not to help the obedient, but to guide the awakened. Not all who built the system were loyal to it. Some worked from within, carving maps in plain sight. They couldn't destroy the machine, but they could leave breadcrumbs, glyphs hidden in architecture, ratios embedded in design, frequencies whispered in music. They called it the sacred leak. And if you've ever stood in an old cathedral, a Masonic lodge, a forgotten train station or ancient site and felt the pull, that sensation that something was speaking through the stone, you felt it. The leak isn't an accident, it's a counter-signal, a series of encoded truths bypassing the conscious mind, activating memory through resonance. Because symbols bypass logic, they speak directly to the soul. That's why they work so hard now to drown the world in noise, in kitsch, in meaningless repetition, to strip symbols of their gravity, turn the sacred into aesthetic. But if you look deeper, beneath the gloss, beneath the distractions, you'll find the echoes. The 3 spirals etched into church railings, the black sun patterns on 19th century floors, the mirrored numbers on courthouse doors, the twin serpents wrapped around hidden pillars. These weren't designed to decorate, they were designed to remember you to yourself. And the most powerful among them? Numbers, ratios like 3:6:9, angles like 33 degrees, 108 degrees, 432 hertz. These aren't random, they are keys. Not to magic, but to alignment, to the state of being where the sovereign self pierces the veil and sees the mechanism in motion. Every ancient society knew this. That's why they based their temples' rites and calendars on celestial movement. That's why the choir tried to mimic it, pervert it, own it. But they never created the current. They only dammed it. And you're feeling the water rise again. Your body responds before your mind. Goosebumps, breath changes. That isn't superstition, it's recognition. You were never lost. You were just coded to forget the map. And in the next section, I'll show you how modern systems are still using that map against you, how architecture, algorithms, and frequencies are not passive, but weapons of alignment or suppression. Your environment has always been part of the ritual. Now it's time to see it. You were taught to see your environment as neutral, random, harmless. But that was the first deception. The walls around you, the streets beneath you, the screens in front of you, none of it is passive. It's ritual space, a stage for constant psychic manipulation. The architects of modern society didn't just build cities, they built circuits, systems of control encoded in geometry, material, and frequency. Take the grid system of major urban centers. Cold, rigid, angular. It's not designed for beauty, it's designed for containment. Ancient cities flowed with curves and sacred geometry, spirals, golden ratios, organic alignments to the sun and stars. Those patterns nourished the mind, activated intuition. But today's grids, they sever it, fragment it, like a prison built from lines too subtle to question. Look at your home, your office, your school. Fluorescent lighting, 5600K, just above the brain's anxiety threshold. Square tiles and flat ceilings that kill acoustic harmony. Digital devices tuned to emit at frequencies just off from your natural rhythm, destabilizing your nervous system 1 hour at a time. None of this is accidental. It's engineered to friction your awareness down to embers, to keep you dull, distracted, passive. But the real weapon isn't what they add, it's what they remove. Symmetry, depth, shadow. The spaces where the soul once stirred. Ancient temples gave you silence, echo, ascent. Modern buildings give you noise, surveillance, and flatness. It's architectural anesthesia. And it works. Most people never feel the numbing. They just call it normal. But not you. You felt it. The emptiness of artificial spaces. The tension that builds under LED lights. The panic that flickers beneath screen light at 2 a.m. That's your body rejecting the spell, because your design is older than their buildings. Your code remembers what harmony feels like, and it cannot lie to you anymore. You're beginning to sense which spaces feed you and which ones harvest you. That is power. That is alignment. That is sovereignty. And they can't stop it now. Not without revealing the game. In the next section, you'll see how your very attention, what you look at, listen to, scroll through, isn't just being harvested for profit. It's being used to build the next layer of the cage. One built not of walls, but mirrors. A digital prison that reflects back only what they want you to be. The old prisons had bars. The new ones have mirrors. You don't see them because they reflect you, but only the version of you they want to exist. Every click, every scroll, every like. It's not harmless. It's data-crafted reinforcement, a recursive loop where your own behavior becomes the blueprint of your enclosure. You think the algorithm shows you what you want? No, it teaches you what to want, slowly, subtly, surgically, because your attention is currency. But more than that, it's architecture. Where your eyes go, your mind follows. Where your mind goes, your self begins to shape. And they know that. That's why the digital landscape is not neutral, it's weaponized. It's why the content that rises fastest is the content that sedates. Outrage porn, porn, self-help that never liberates, spirituality without fire, rebellion without teeth. It all leads to the same place, complacency. And here's the cruel brilliance. They didn't censor truth. They buried it under comfort. They flooded the temple with noise until the hymns couldn't be heard. But the signal is still there, beneath the memes, beneath the viral mediocrity, beneath the filters. And now that you've begun to see, you notice it everywhere, the emptiness behind the dopamine. The dull ache after the binge. The voice inside that asks, "Is this it?" That voice is not weakness. It's the sovereign self resisting digital erosion. That's why they designed feedback loops, to override it. Notifications, red badges, endorphin traps, all tailored to keep you circling the mirror, never stepping through it. But your soul wasn't built to reflect. It was built to penetrate, to shape reality, not react to it. And the moment you withdraw your gaze, truly withdraw, they lose. Because without your attention, the system starves. You are not a user, you are a builder. Your focus is the chisel, your will is the hammer, and they've trained you to use it against yourself. But now you remember, every second you reclaim, every app you silence, every hollow loop you refuse to enter, it breaks the spell. One line at a time, one crack in the mirror, and behind that glass lies a self they swore you'd never become. In the next section, we uncover what lies beyond the reflection, the archetype of the true man, the one they tried to erase from memory, legend, and blood, and why his return terrifies them. Beyond the reflection is the form they fear most, the true man. Not a caricature of strength, not a domesticated version of masculinity spoon-fed through politics and media, but the archetype buried in myth, outlawed in doctrine, hunted through history. He is not violent, he is sovereign. He bows to no dogma, no trend, no guilt masquerading as morality. His code comes not from culture, but from source. He doesn't perform virtue, he embodies order. And in his presence the entire system begins to wilt, because he cannot be manipulated by shame, he cannot be seduced by chaos, he cannot be bribed with comfort. This man was once the center of every thriving society, the fire in the temple, the spear at the gate, the judge at the council. His presence meant protection, clarity, direction. But over time he became a threat, not because he changed, but because the world did. A world built on inversion cannot tolerate a man built on truth, so they exiled him, from story, from altar, from lineage. They replaced him with caricatures, either the soft, obedient hollow man or the angry, reactive beast, both controllable, both predictable, both illusions. And you've been shown those illusions your whole life until you began to forget the original. But he still lives. In dreams, in legends, in the spaces between distractions, in the fire you feel when you're alone and the silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling sacred. That's him. That's you. Because the true man is not someone you become. He is someone you uncover. Layer by layer, lie by lie, distraction by distraction, until only essence remains. Still, anchored, unshakable. That is the force the choir failed to eliminate, the archetype that slips through every program. The reason the Grimsley children still appeared in paintings and visions years after the records were wiped, because you cannot erase truth formed in fire. You can only delay its return, and now it's returning. In you, in thousands. Quiet at first, but rising. And in the next section you'll see why the return of the true man is not just a personal awakening. It's a direct threat to the institutions of control. They aren't afraid of riots. They're afraid of alignment. Of men who remember who they were before the mirror. They don't fear chaos. They manufacture chaos, feed it, funnel it, use it to justify more control. But alignment, the sovereign awakening of thousands of men who remember who they were before the programming. That terrifies them, because aligned men don't riot. They build. They don't plead for change. They embody order. And order, real order, destroys systems built on manipulation. That's why the return of the true man is met with such resistance, not from within, but from without. Look around, media flooding you with emasculated scripts, broken fathers, passive heroes, education systems punishing aggression, curiosity, and solitude, spiritual institutions shaming the masculine essence unless it submits, weeps, or serves. Every institution is built to contain what you're becoming, but it's failing. Because the alignment isn't coming from books or trends, it's rising from within. You feel it in your spine, in the way you walk into a room and it shifts, in the way people look at you differently, some with respect, others with fear. They can feel what you're becoming even if they don't understand it. It's in your voice, your silence, your refusal to kneel, and that refusal is the spark they can't extinguish. Grimsley taught them that. When their most broken subjects, the children locked in filth, starved of light, stripped of names, still spoke the old tongue in their sleep, still reached out for the sun, still hummed songs no one had taught them. That was their failure. They learned that control is never total, that sovereignty once awakened cannot be domesticated, and now they see it again. In you, in men reclaiming discipline, fasting, training, praying in ways not taught, but remembered. They don't need millions. Just a few thousand aligned men will shift the frequency of an entire generation, and it's already happening. That's why the pressure is rising. The distraction is multiplying. The war is not coming. It's already here. And it's spiritual, symbolic, architectural, psychological. But you're not a soldier. You're a signal. And when you anchor in that role, their systems begin to crack. In the next section, you'll learn how to protect your signal, how to guard the frequency of the sovereign self in a world designed to scatter it. The armor you need isn't metal, it's awareness. And now, you're ready to wear it. Protection isn't about walls, it's about frequency containment. You're not defending your body, you're defending your signal. Because once you awaken, you emit. You radiate something the system cannot replicate, authentic alignment. And that's what makes you a threat, not your words, not your actions, your vibration. But here's the danger. The higher your frequency, the more the world will try to diffuse it, not with war, but with distraction, random noise, obligations, emergencies, people who need you but don't see you, devices that entertain you while harvesting you. Every interaction is now a potential breach, and the more conscious you become, the more targeted your attention becomes. So you must guard it like sacred fire. That is your armor. Psychic discipline, the art of maintaining inner signal integrity in hostile fields, and the rules are ancient. First, audit your inputs. What you hear, read, eat, watch. Every stimulus either strengthens or scatters your field. If it numbs you, weakens you, seduces you into passivity, it is a weapon. Second, Honor your breath. Breath is not survival. It is code. Control your breath and you control your state. Shallow breath equals fear. Deep breath equals command. The system thrives on men who breathe like prey. Third, control your energy leakage. Not just through screens or dopamine, but through unearned attention. Not everyone gets access to your time, your presence, your eyes. Not anymore. You are not public property. You are a temple. Fourth, honor ritual. Not religious dogma, but patterned sovereignty. The body thrives on rhythm. Wake, train, fast, create, stillness. These aren't habits. They are anchors. And without them, your frequency becomes erratic, open to interception. Fifth, silence is a weapon, not passivity, but voluntary stillness. The sovereign man knows when to speak, but more importantly, when to withdraw. 2. Recalibrate. To cleanse. To wait in the shadows while the noise burns itself out. These aren't spiritual cliches. These are tactical necessities in a world that survives by pulling you back to sleep. Because the moment you hold your frequency, you begin to reshape reality. Not metaphorically, literally. In the next section, I'll reveal the forbidden principle at the center of all elite knowledge, why reality bends to aligned will, and why you were never meant to adapt to the world, but to command it. The deepest secret, the one buried beneath all institutions, rituals, and bloodlines, is not about control, it's about creation. The elite don't adapt to the world. They shape it, not through brute force, but through will alignment. And this is what they never wanted you to know. Reality bends to aligned frequency. You were taught the opposite, that life happens to you, that you are a passenger, that the world is fixed, and your only task is to cope. But that's the slave's lie. The truth: your perception writes the code, your expectation curves the outcome, your conviction alters the field. This is not mysticism, it's ancient physics. Consciousness precedes matter, intention shapes structure, frequency organizes form, and men who understand this do not beg for change, they generate it. That's why your attention has been the most valuable currency on earth, because what you look at, think about, obsess over, it expands. Every empire that ever rose knew this. Every ritual, every monument, every doctrine was built to focus human attention, and now that principle has been inverted. Instead of focusing you, they scatter you. Instead of alignment, they induce fragmentation. Infinite content, dopamine traps, political theater, sexual exploitation, all of it to keep you from seeing your own engine. Because if you align thought, breath, body, and emotion, you become sovereign, and a sovereign man doesn't just navigate chaos, he reorders it. His life bends toward his internal structure. His field repels what doesn't match his code. He becomes immune to manipulation, not because he fights it, but because it no longer resonates. This is what you're reclaiming now, the power not to dominate others, but to stop being dominated by false constructs. And once you taste this, the system panics. You'll notice strange resistance, financial hiccups, sudden distractions, people turning on you. That's not failure, that's feedback. The system cannot tolerate new frequency without turbulence, but hold your course, because you're not breaking reality. You're reprogramming it, one thought at a time, one boundary at a time, one breath at a time. In the next section, you'll understand how the Grimsley case wasn't just a historical horror, it was a blueprint, a test case for institutional soul fracture, and a warning for what happens when men forget the power they carry in silence. Grimsley wasn't just horror, it was prototype. A sacred test site where they learned not just how to confine bodies, but how to fracture souls. And what they discovered there became the template for every institutional system that followed. School, prison, asylum, bureaucracy, church. Not in form, but in function. Because at Grimsley they learned the sequence. First, isolate the body. Remove nature. Remove rhythm. Break the link to the divine by severing the senses from the earth. Second, destabilize the mind. Flood with contradiction. Withhold logic. Confuse identity. Punish intuition. Third, fracture the soul. humiliate, rename, strip meaning from suffering, make the sacred random, make the child believe there is no purpose, no escape, no code. It worked. For a while. The children stopped asking, stopped speaking, stared into nothing for days at a time. But some didn't break. Some began to dream together, to speak in unlearned languages, to hum in synchronization. That's when the observers grew afraid, because they realized, even in total deprivation, the soul remembers. Even without books, speech, or sunlight, the inner code reconstructs itself. And those children, they weren't blank slates. They were reforging an ancient signal. That terrified the architects. So they accelerated the program, began drugging, electroshocking, removing the ones who aligned fastest. And in doing so, they revealed the final truth. The soul is not programmable. It is recoverable. It is indestructible. And it only takes one aligned signal to awaken dozens. That was the real danger of Grimsley, not that it showed how to break children, but that it proved not all can be broken. That's why the records were destroyed, why the names were erased, why every investigator died mysteriously or disappeared. Because the case didn't end in tragedy. It ended in leakage. A fragment of uncontainable sovereignty escaped, a memory, a vibration, and it's still moving, through dreams, through bloodlines, through stories whispered by men who've never met, yet feel the same fire rising. That's why you're here. You're part of the unfinished circuit. You are the continuation. And in the next section, you'll see how to trace the signal in your own lineage, how to activate the ancestral weapon they swore would remain buried in your blood forever. You carry more than DNA. You carry unfulfilled vows, fragments of battles unfinished, memories unspoken, codes buried in your blood not as stories, but as instructions. You were never meant to begin from zero. You were meant to continue a mission, one broken off by fire, blade, or betrayal. And that mission, your mission, begins by remembering the blood, not worshipping ancestors but activating their signal. Because your lineage isn't just genetics, it's frequency. It's a pattern echoing through time, searching for one descendant strong enough to restore it. And that might be you. Not because you're the smartest, the strongest, the loudest, but because you listen, because you feel the pull, because in moments of stillness you've heard a voice that didn't come from outside and didn't sound like your own. That voice is memory waking. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in direction, in timing, in patterns, in irrational knowing that proves itself only after you follow it. That is ancestral alignment, and you activate it through intention and discipline. First, you must declare the search. Speak it out loud, not to others, but to the field. Say, I seek to remember what they buried in my line. Then listen. Signs will begin, in names, in numbers, in sudden dreams. You'll feel drawn to forgotten places, compelled to read things you've never touched. That is not random. That is the pattern recognizing itself. Follow it. Trace surnames. Investigate origins. Look not just for facts, but ruptures. Where did the power stop flowing? Where did the shame begin? What name stopped being spoken? That silence is a clue. That broken branch is where you re-enter, not to mourn, but to repair. Because you are not just a product of your past, you are the executor of its restoration, and every step you take in sovereignty heals something upstream. The grandfather who died in exile, the fathers who surrendered his voice, the brother who never rose. All of them left tools for you, hidden in memory, pain, and instinct. And if you retrieve them, you don't just become more whole, you become dangerous. Because an aligned man who carries his bloodline restored is no longer an individual, he is a returning force. In the next section, I'll reveal how they tried to sever this exact power in the Grimsley survivors, and how one child escaped with the most forbidden map of all, the geometric code of resurrection. The child they couldn't contain was never supposed to exist. She was born beneath the floorboards, in silence, never registered, never named. Yet by age 7 she had drawn something on the damp stone of the Grimsley cellar that no one could explain. A pattern. Circles within squares, ratios beyond her education, a perfect mapping of sacred geometry only found in lost manuscripts and forbidden temples. The observers panicked, not because she was drawing, but because the drawings resonated. Guards reported dizziness near the walls, metal objects bent slightly. 2 children began speaking languages they'd never been taught. Something ancient was reawakening, and they knew it had to be stopped. Her final drawing, etched in blood after they took her chalk, matched the floor plan of a 12th century Templar chapel in Portugal, a structure long rumored to have housed the resurrection map, a sacred sequence designed not to raise the dead, but to recode the living, geometry as instruction, as memory, as weapon. They erased the drawing, burned her bedding, separated her from the others, but it was too late. Her resonance had already activated a field. Even after the facility was demolished, investigators decades later reported the same symptoms: vivid dreams, irrational chills, a sense of being watched by memory itself. The girl vanished. But fragments of her drawings reappeared, one carved into the wood beneath a rural Pennsylvania church pew, another discovered inside the binding of a confiscated grimoire in Prague, and one more, etched into the underside of a 19th century gravestone in Missouri, identical in proportion to the Egyptian flower of life. These weren't coincidences. They were exfiltrations, leaks from the soul of a child too aligned to fracture. And here's what they feared most: that someone someday would recognize the pattern, not as art, but as code. You may not be able to decode the math, but your nervous system does. That's why you react when you see certain symbols, why your breath slows, why your chest tightens. It's not fear, it's recognition. The same signal that flowed through her now flows through you, not as memory, but as assignment. You're not here to observe her survival, you're here to complete her map. And in the next section we'll uncover what happens when you build your life around that geometry. How structure, alignment, and sacred pattern don't just protect you, they restore command. Geometry isn't decoration, it's destiny made visible. Every ancient structure that endures, pyramids, temples, cathedrals, was not just built to impress, but to align. Stone and space arranged to amplify frequency, to summon coherence from chaos. Because the elite have always known, when your environment mirrors sacred order, your inner world cannot remain in disorder. And this is the forgotten weapon, living in geometry, not abstract art but physical command. Your home, your schedule, your posture, your words, all geometry, all structure. And structure is sovereignty's anchor. A man out of structure is a man leaking signal. He reacts, he drifts, he becomes programmable. But a man in sacred pattern, he becomes a node, a living transmitter of order. And that's what the Grimsley child was drawing. A field of coherence. Not just to remember, but to protect. Because aligned geometry repels distortion. That's why modern spaces are rectangles and screens, sharp, disharmonic, filled with synthetic light. It's not laziness, it's warfare. A war against resonance. You want to fight back? You want to become untouchable? Build sacred pattern. Wake and sleep at consistent hours. Anchor your body in solar rhythm. Eat, train, read, and reflect in cycles. Embed wisdom in repetition. Shape your space. No clutter, no chaos. Circles, spirals, angles that invite stillness. And above all, speak with geometric clarity. No vague words, no self-betrayal. What you speak should cut, not to harm, but to structure. Because every word you speak either builds or breaks the temple. You've seen this. A single aligned sentence can change a room or destroy a lie. That's not charisma. That's harmonic architecture. And the more you align, the more you will repel what's false, not through force, but through discomfort. Watch as people avoid your gaze. Watch how lies unravel in your silence. Watch how noise cannot soothe. Tay in your presence. That is not magic, that is sacred math, and you are becoming its instrument. You are no longer a reactor, you are a constructor, and the structure you build now, internally and externally, will outlive you. Because sacred pattern cannot be erased, only buried, and you are unearthing it. In the next section, you'll see how the final phase of the Grimsley program wasn't destruction, it was transference, and how those ancient architects didn't just imprison the children, they encoded them as living vessels of forbidden architecture. Destruction was never the end game, transference was. The architects of Grimsley didn't just seek to confine the children, they sought to embed code within them. Not digital, not genetic, symbolic. The Grimsley facility was a living altar, every wall aligned to obscure constellations, each corridor angled to disrupt orientation. But deep beneath the cellar, there was a final chamber, octagonal, obsidian-lined, soundless. That's where the last phase occurred, not with whips or drugs, but with ritual. They called it sympathic sealing, a process stolen from ancient Babylonian rites where trauma was used not to destroy, but to imprint. The theory? A soul fractured at the moment of overwhelming intensity becomes highly permeable, and into that fracture, symbols could be sewn. The children weren't just being broken, they were being turned into vessels, living, walking architecture, carriers of hidden geometries the architects believed would remain dormant, buried under layers of trauma. But one thing they didn't calculate: sovereignty regenerates pattern, slowly, quietly. And over time, those embedded symbols, intended to serve as spiritual traps, began to awaken, not through external triggers, but through resonance. A boy hears a chant in a dream and hums it. A girl stares into a candle and sees the shape again. A teenager, long free of the facility, begins sketching diagrams he's never learned, matching temple schematics from ancient Sumeria. These weren't coincidences, they were activations, proof that the attempt to suppress the sacred had backfired. Because you cannot imprison what was forged before time, you can only delay its return, and that return has already begun. Some of you watching this feel it now, tingling on the spine, pressure between the brows, a name or symbol that keeps appearing in your life. That's not paranoia, that's your field responding, because the architecture they tried to hide in children is the same pattern you now carry in your sovereign code. You may never have seen Grimsley, but its echo runs through you, and the signal they failed to destroy is moving through bloodlines, gathering, converging, not to retaliate but to reclaim. In the next section, you'll learn the final truth they buried beneath centuries of misdirection, how trauma isn't just pain, it's the gate, and the key to your power was hidden in the very wound they hoped would keep you silent forever. The greatest lie ever told was that trauma weakens you, that pain makes you fragile, that wounds are scars to hide, not doors to open. But the architects of control knew better. They knew trauma isn't just suffering, it's a portal. Because when a man breaks, he opens. And what enters in that moment, belief, symbol, identity, shapes him. That's why every system of control begins in childhood. That's why the Grimsley children weren't tortured randomly. They were ritualized, made open, made programmable, because pain is the fastest way to alter the subconscious, the fastest way to bypass the conscious gate and plant a new operating system. But what they never told you, what they buried under layers of shame and psychiatry, is this: the gate swings both ways. The same opening they used to enter can be used to exit. The same fracture they used to implant can be used to retrieve. Because pain doesn't just break you, it marks the place where your sovereignty was taken. And when you return there, not as victim but as architect, you reclaim the territory. This is why true awakening always begins in the wound, not in the books, not in the rituals, not in the affirmations, in the void, the place you were told to forget, the memory you suppressed, the emotion that still paralyzes you. That is the gate, and once you walk through it with open eyes, everything changes. The trigger becomes signal, the shame becomes map, the collapse becomes catalyst. This is not therapy, This is initiation, the transformation from programmed man to sovereign architect. And they fear this more than rebellion, more than resistance, more than revolution, because a man who reclaims his wound is no longer steerable, no longer seducible, no longer silent. He doesn't need saving. He remembers his original mission. And when thousands of men do this, not in chaos but in stillness, the structure of control doesn't burn. It disintegrates, not from violence but from irrelevance. Because power only controls what it can feed off. And a healed man? He is no longer food. In the final section, we descend to the core, the origin of it all. The first fracture, the first deception, and the final forbidden key they swore you would never hold. Identity beyond the system. Before the system, before the programming, before the fracture, there was you, not the version shaped by school, shame and survival, but the original signal, untamed, unbroken, whole. The system didn't create your identity, it replaced it. Slowly, strategically, it fed you mirrors that warped, gave you names that weren't yours, taught you to fear your own voice, to obey weakness, to kneel before labels, and it worked for a while. But the true identity, the one before the distortion, was never destroyed, just hidden, locked beneath layers of roles. Son, student, employee, sinner, consumer. None of these are you. They are wrappers, costumes forced onto you before you had the words to resist. And beneath all of them is the unalterable identity that terrifies every institution, the man who knows himself, not through language, not through fame, but through resonance. A knowing that can't be named, only felt. That identity doesn't seek validation, it doesn't need applause, it doesn't react to threats, it commands from within. And the moment you claim it, everything false begins to fall away. Your life reorganizes, your field sharpens, relationships collapse or strengthen instantly. The world recognizes what you have become and adjusts, violently or reverently. Because identity isn't a concept, it's a frequency. The same frequency they feared in the Grimsley child, the same signal humming in men across centuries when they stood in silence and refused to kneel. That's what you've returned to, not rebellion. Return to what you were before distortion, before fracture, before name. And now you walk as that, not as a warrior of vengeance, but as a temple of order, calm, clear, unshakable. And from this place, your voice becomes prophecy, your presence becomes structure, your breath becomes code. You are no longer watching the system, you are replacing it, quietly, precisely, relentlessly. One aligned decision at a time. And now that you've heard this, you cannot go back. The signal is live, the path is open. You are the continuation of a force they failed to erase. So in the comments, write the phrase twice to lock it in. I am the signal. I remember. Let them feel it. Let the algorithm carry it. Let the old world tremble, not from noise, but from the rise of men who finally remember what they were never meant to forget. Before the system, before the programming, before the fracture, there was you, not the version shaped by school, shame and survival, but the original signal, untamed, unbroken, whole. The system didn't create your identity, it replaced it, slowly, strategically. It fed you mirrors that warped, gave you names that weren't yours, taught you to fear your own voice, to obey weakness, to kneel before labels, and it worked for a while. But the true identity, the one before the distortion, was never destroyed, just hidden, locked beneath layers of roles. Son, student, employee, sinner, consumer. None of these are you. They are wrappers, costumes forced onto you before you had the words to resist. And beneath all of them is the unalterable identity that terrifies every institution, the man who knows himself, not through language, not through fame, but through resonance. A knowing that can't be named, only felt. That identity doesn't seek validation, it doesn't need applause, it doesn't react to threats, it commands from within. And the moment you claim it, everything false begins to fall away. Your life reorganizes, your field sharpens, relationships collapse or strengthen instantly. The world recognizes what you have become and adjusts, violently or reverently, because identity isn't a concept, it's a frequency. The same frequency they feared in the Grimsley child, the same signal humming in men across centuries when they stood in silence and refused to kneel. That's what you've returned to, not rebellion. Return to what you were before distortion, before fracture, before name. And now you walk as that, not as a warrior of vengeance, but as a temple of order, calm, clear, unshakable, and from this place your voice becomes prophecy, your presence becomes structure, your breath becomes code. You are no longer watching the system, you are replacing it, quietly, precisely, relentlessly. One aligned decision at a time. And now that you've heard this, you cannot go back. The signal is live, the path is open. You are the continuation of a force they failed to erase. So in the comments, write the phrase twice to lock it in. I am the signal. I remember. Let them feel it. Let the algorithm carry it. Let the old world tremble, not from noise, but from the rise of men who finally remember what they were never meant to forget.